I'm Shanía and welcome to episode 1 of DIY or BUY, a series where you send me clothes from the internet, I try to make them, and I let you know if it's worth the time or if it's worth the money. In today's episode, I'll be trying to make this overall dress from Shein, and I actually have another video where I talk about how I would go about making it, but today I'll actually be putting my ideas to the test. So I took some measurements to make my pattern. I measured the circumference of my waist, which was about 33 inches. I measured the circumference of my hips, and that was about 40 inches. I also measured the circumference of my knees, and that was about 27 inches. And then I measured the distance from my waist to the bottom of where the skirt will be, and that was about 37 inches. And I also measured the distance from my waist to my hips, and then from my hips to my knees, and then from the knees down to the bottom of the dress. And shout out to these Thinks shorts. If you know, you know. I folded my fabric in half and I started making marks to map out the pattern. And I wanted to mention that all of the circumference measurements that I got, I divided them all by 4 since I'm making a quarter of the pattern. And this is what the pattern is looking like. I cut out 2 of these pieces, one for the front and one for the back. And honestly, I'm a little worried that it might be a little too big, but we'll see how it goes.
Alright, so the next thing we have is what I'm calling the Cami. So the reason why I'm calling this part the Cami is because it, to me anyway, it basically looks like a camisole top. Like, you know, like a basic spaghetti strap top. And the only difference is that instead of it being like on top of the breast, it's underneath it. That's how I think of it.
Then I started sketching out the measurements for the cami part of the dress. So I recorded how long I want it to be, about 7 inches. The width, I want it to be about 33 inches, which is the same as the top of the skirt. And then I want the curve to be a total of 10 inches. And then I want the strap to be 1 inch. I'm going to make the cami part of the dress by tracing this cropped camisole that I have. So I'm literally just going to fold it in half, and then I'm going to trace it onto the fabric. But the thing that I'm mostly concerned with tracing is the curve part, like the curve of the neckline and the curve of the armhole. So I'm just going to trace this onto the fabric. Let's go. This is what the traced patterns look like. I only added seam allowance at the side and the bottom of the patterns because I'll be using bias binding at the top edge of both pieces. And I have a feeling I'm going to have to trim it down, but we'll see what happens after I try it on. I cut out the pattern pieces so that I had a front and a back piece for the cami part of the dress, as well as the front and the back piece of the skirt part of the dress. I took the skirt part of the dress and I flipped it so that it was right side facing up. I took the cami part and turned it upside down and put it on top of the skirt part so that it's right sides facing, and then I did a straight stitch along the seam allowance line on top of both layers. So I just finished stitching the first panel, the front panel of the dress. And like I said, I have a feeling the hips are going to be too wide, but it's easier to take off than it is to add. It looks like a fish. It really does. I'm basically going to repeat the same step with the other 2 pieces.
So, what's next?
I'm just going to sandwich them right sides facing and then do a straight stitch along the seam allowance line, and then I'll come back and show you what it looks like. Okay, bye. Both pieces are right side up, and I'm going to take one of the pieces and sandwich it so that the right side of this piece is on top of the right side of the front piece. And then I'm going to straight stitch along the seam allowance line. I'm really excited about sewing this dress because I've been thinking that I really want to rework my closet. I feel like my closet is like very safe. It has a lot of things that I'll wear casually. In my mind, I'm just kind of like, fancy things are to be worn for fancy occasions, right? But I feel like I want to change my mindset with that. This year, I want to think of every moment as worthy. Like, if you want to wear a fancy dress to the laundromat, then do it, because life itself is worth the celebration. To heck with that saving outfits for special occasions. I feel like this dress will be a good segue into that, because it's not super fancy, but at the same time, it's also not like entirely basic. And if I pair it with something that's like fancy, like a collared shirt or something, for example, then it'll really like kind of up it, you know? So I think this dress is really gonna open up the gates, you know? So I'm definitely looking forward to making it. So this is what the two panels look like stitched together. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this bias binding tape and then I'm just going to add it to the top edge of this whole entire piece. So this is the bias binding, which I have a link to in the description, and you can see there's a line going straight down the middle to indicate that it's the center. So what I'm going to do is just put the edge of my fabric right along that center line and then fold it over so that the other edge of the bias binding is covering the edge of the fabric. So here is a paper demonstration. So this is the center line of the bias binding. Then I'll take the edge of my dress and line it up to that center line. I'll zigzag stitch the edge of the dress down onto the bias. Then I'll fold the other edge of the bias binding over the edge of the dress and then stitch it down with a straight stitch all along the edge of the bias binding. Excuse my hair, it's in progress. I'm in the comfort of my home and I know you're not judging me, right? This is the bias binding attached. How lovely, how clean is that? I also ironed it down to give it like a really crisp finish. So the next thing I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to basically stack the front and the back by folding it in half so that the right sides are facing. And you can see that this was the first seam that I had stitched. And now I'm just going to sew along this open seam where these two open flaps are. Straight stitch along the seam allowance line on this side. And that's going to close up the dress. And then from there, I'll try it on and just kind of do a fitting. I'm trying it on. I just finished stitching it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try it on inside out so that way I can kind of like mark it up. And I'm just going to start like pinching the areas that I want tighter, like here, for example, like by the waist, I want that to be in more, like this area here. The bottom is not as mermaid as I wanted it to be, but that's because of the amount of fabric that I had, like the width of the fabric itself. This was literally the widest I could make it. And I'm just wondering how I'm gonna walk in this because it's a little tight. It's a little tight. I don't know. I made my marks on the dress where I want to add the new seam line. You can see it in the blue chalk. Like I said, it's really from the knee up. Here as well, I'll be taking in, pinching in. So I did that for both sides. So now I'm just gonna take the dress off and then I'm just going to like true the lines by making them like more accurate. And then I'm gonna just take it to the sewing machine and sew along the new seam allowance lines. This is how it's looking with the new seam allowance lines. So you can see that this is like the flap. I'm feeling really good about it at this point. The next thing that I have to do is just serge off this excess fabric here so that I can get rid of the bulk. At this point, this is all the fabric that I have left. I bought a yard of fabric to start with. And it was actually a little bit more than a yard because it was like the very end of the, what is it called? I don't know, whatever the term is. It was like the end of it. So he just gave me all that was left, which was a little bit more than a yard. I think I may have to buy more fabric. They didn't have the same type of fabric that I started out with, so I got spandex fabric instead. Then I used these measurements to make 2 straps. I took my strap and I turned it so that the right side was facing up, and then I folded it in half so that the right side is now inside of the fold. And then I'm going to do a straight stitch along the seam allowance line along the top and the side of the fabric like so, and repeat the same steps for the other strap. This is my strap, and you can see that I don't have the seam allowance lines on it, and I'm going to show you how I manage to accurately sew without the seam allowance lines. So in theory, I could use these guidelines, but I always forget the amount each line represents. So instead, I use this seam guide ruler and a magnetic seam guide. I start by making sure that my needle is set to the middle, and then I find my seam allowance amount on the ruler. So in my case, that's a 1/2 inch. And then I put the ruler down on the plate and I bring my needle down into the hole of that seam allowance amount. And then I line up the magnet right next to the edge of the ruler. And then from there, I can remove the ruler. And now I'm just going to fold my strap in half. And I'm going to make sure that the edge of my fold is right next to the magnet, because that basically means that the distance between the magnet and where the needle is going to come down on the fabric is a 1/2 inch distance, which is my seam allowance. So I put it down, I pull down my presser foot, and then I just stitch regularly. And to show you that this method is accurate, I'll show you here that I'm measuring the distance between the stitches to the edge of the fabric, and you can see it's a 1/2 inch. So I definitely recommend this tool if you don't feel like always transferring your seam allowance line on your patterns. After I finished sewing my straps, I cut off the excess seam allowance fabric so that about 1/8 of an inch of fabric was left outside of the seam allowance stitches, like so. I also trimmed off the seam allowance fabric near the bottom of the strap. After that, I took a safety pin and I basically flipped the strap inside out by pushing the safety pin through the inside of the strap and then just kind of pulling the fabric down over the safety pin. But because I stitched the top edge of the strap, I had to take out the stitches so that I was able to pull through the safety pin. Once I removed all of the stitches, I just pulled the safety pin through the strap and fully turned it inside out like this. And then I took the bottom edge of the strap and I just folded the 2 ends into each other so that I could close out the bottom of the strap. And then I did a straight stitch on top of those 2 folded in edges. And I'm literally just going to repeat the same steps with the other strap. And after I finished sewing my straps, I just ironed it down to keep it nice and flat and professional looking. And it looked something like this. And you can see where I stitched the bottom edge of the strap. And then with the dress right side up, I faced the right side of the strap to the right side of the dress. And then I did a straight stitch along the top edge so that when I flip the strap over, it'll look something like this. And then I did another top stitch over the strap. And then I'll basically repeat the same steps with the other side of the dress. I'm back with the straps. So I attached the straps. This is what they look like. And then after that, I tried on the dress and I made marks for where I want the buttons to go. I made a mark on the strap for where the buttonhole will go to match the button. And I did that for both of the straps. So there's another mark here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach the buttons here to the back of the dress, and then I'm going to make a buttonhole where I put the mark on the straps. If you're looking for a more detailed tutorial on how to sew a button to a garment, whether by hand or with your sewing machine, then check out the link in the description box for a detailed explanation of how I did it. All right, onward. I created a fake button placket by using these measurements here on the screen, and I just folded over the top edge and the bottom edge along where the seam allowance line is, and then I'm just going to do a straight stitch to keep those two folds down into place, and it looks something like this. The next thing I did was I folded the edge of the square so that it lined up with the seam allowance line, and it's okay if it overlaps just a little bit, that's fine. And then I just ironed it down to keep it flat in place. I measured and marked the halfway point of the top of the dress, and then I took my placket and I lined up the edge of the placket to that mark just below the binding, and then I did a straight stitch as close as possible to the fold of the placket, and it looks something like this. After that, I attached my two buttons to the placket, and then after that I top stitched the edge of the placket as close as possible to the edge down onto the front part of the dress. So how did I do? You think I did a good job? Let me know in the comments and let me know what you'd like to see me make next. I think this dress is definitely worth the time. DIY it. Until next time, ciao.